Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. In this vote harvesting time, they use terms like the Great Society, or as we were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. But they've been a little more explicit in the past, and among themselves, and all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the President as our moral teacher and our leader, and he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. He must be freed so that he can do for us what he knows is best. And Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as the masses. This is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the full power of centralized government, this was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also knew, those Founding Fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy. Now, we have no better example of this than government's involvement in the farm economy over the last 30 years. Since 1955, the cost of this program has nearly doubled. 1/4 of farming in America is responsible for 85% of the farm surplus. 3/4 of farming is out on the free market and has known a 21% increase in the per capita consumption of all its produce. You see that 1/4 of farming? That's regulated and controlled by the federal government. In the last 3 years, we've spent $43 in the feed grain program for every dollar bushel of corn we don't grow. Senator Humphrey last week charged that Barry Goldwater, as president, would seek to eliminate farmers. He should do his homework a little better, because he'll find out that we've had a decline of 5 million in the farm population under these government programs. He'll also find that the Democratic administration has sought to get from Congress extension of the farm program to include that 3/4 that is now free. He'll find that they've also asked for the right to imprison farmers who wouldn't keep books as prescribed by the federal government. The Secretary of Agriculture asked for the right to seize farms through condemnation and resell them to other individuals. And contained in that same program was a provision that would have allowed the federal government to remove 2 million farmers from the soil. At the same time, there's been an increase in the Department of Agriculture employees. There's now 1 for every 30 farms in the United States. And still, they can't tell us how 66 shiploads of grain headed for Austria disappeared without a trace, and Billy Sol Estes never left shore. Every responsible farmer and farm organization has repeatedly asked the government to free the farm economy. But who are farmers to know what's best for them? The wheat farmers voted against a wheat program. The government passed it anyway. Now the price of bread goes up, the price of wheat to the farmer goes down. Meanwhile, back in the city, under urban renewal, the assault on freedom carries on. Private property rights so diluted that public interest is almost anything a few government planners decide it should be. In a program that takes from the needy and gives to the greedy, We see such spectacles as in Cleveland, Ohio, $1.5 million building completed only 3 years ago must be destroyed to make way for what government officials call a more compatible use of the land. The president tells us he's now going to start building public housing units in the thousands, where heretofore we've only built them in the hundreds. But FHA and the Veterans Administration tell us they have 120,000 housing units they've taken back through mortgage foreclosure. For 3 decades, we've sought to solve the problems of unemployment through government planning, and the more the plans fail, the more the planners plan. The latest is the Area Redevelopment Agency. They've just declared Rice County, Kansas, a depressed area. Rice County, Kansas has 200 oil wells, and the 14,000 people there have over $30 million on deposit in personal savings in their banks. When the government tells you you're depressed, lie down and be depressed. We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help, the reduction in the need for public housing? But the reverse is true. Each year the need grows greater, the program grows greater. We were told 4 years ago that 17 million people went to bed hungry each night. Well, that was probably true. They were all on a diet. But now we're told that 9.3 million families in this country are poverty-stricken on the basis of earning less than $3,000 a year. Welfare spending 10 times greater than it was in the dark depths of the Depression. We're spending $45 billion on welfare. Now do a little arithmetic and you'll find that if we divided the $45 billion up equally among those 9 million poor families, we'd be able to give each family $4,600 a year. And this, added to their present income, should eliminate poverty. Direct aid to the poor, however, is only running about $600 per family. It would seem that someplace there must be some overhead. So now we declare war on poverty, or you too can be a Bobby Baker. Now, do they honestly expect us to believe that if we add $1 billion to the $45 billion we're spending, one more program to the 30-odd we have, and remember, this new program doesn't replace any, it just duplicates existing programs. Do they believe that poverty is suddenly going to disappear by magic? Well, in all fairness, I should explain there is one part of the new program that isn't duplicated. This is the youth feature. We're now going to solve the dropout problem, juvenile delinquency, by reinstituting something like the old CCC camps. And we're going to put our young people in these camps. But again, we do some arithmetic and we find that we're going to spend each year just on room and board for each young person we help $4,700 a year. We can send them to Harvard for $2,700. Of course, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting Harvard is the answer to juvenile delinquency. But seriously, what are we doing to those we seek to help? Not too long ago, a judge called me here in Los Angeles. He told me of a young woman who'd come before him for a divorce. She had 6 children, was pregnant with her 7th. Under his questioning, she revealed her husband was a laborer earning $250 a month. She wanted the divorce to get an $80 raise. She's eligible for $330 a month in the Aid to Dependent Children program. She got the idea from 2 women in her neighborhood who'd already done that very thing. Yet any time you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, we're denounced as being against their humanitarian goals. They say we're always against things, we're never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so. Now, we're for a provision that destitution should not follow unemployment by reason of old age. And to that end, we've accepted Social Security as a step toward meeting the problem. But we're against those entrusted with this program when they practice deception regarding its fiscal shortcomings, when they charge that any criticism of the program means that we want to end payments to those people who depend on them for a livelihood. They've called it insurance to us in 100 million pieces of literature. But then they appeared before the Supreme Court and they testified it was a welfare program. They only used the term insurance to sell it to the people. And they said Social Security dues are a tax for the general use of the government. And the government has used that tax. There is no fund. Because Robert Byers, the actuarial head, appeared before a congressional committee and admitted that Social Security as of this moment is $298 billion in the hole. But he said there should be no cause for worry, because as long as they had the power to tax, they could always take away from the people whatever they needed to bail them out of trouble. And they're doing just that. A young man, 21 years of age, working at an average salary, his Social Security contribution would in the open market buy him an insurance policy that would guarantee $220 a month at age 65. The government promises $127. He could live it up until he's 31 and then take out a policy that would pay more than Social Security. Now, are we so lacking in business sense that we can't put this program on a sound basis so that people who do require those payments will find they can get them when they're due, that the cupboard isn't bare? Barry Goldwater thinks we can. At the same time, can't we introduce voluntary features that would permit a citizen who can do better on his own to be excused upon presentation of evidence that he had made provision for the non-earning years? Should we not allow a widow with children to work and not lose the benefits supposedly paid for by her deceased husband? Shouldn't you and I be allowed to declare who our beneficiaries will be under this program, which we cannot do? I think we're for telling our senior citizens that no one in this country should be denied medical care because of a lack of funds. But I think we're against forcing all citizens, regardless of need, into a compulsory government program, especially when we have such examples as was announced last week when France admitted that their Medicare program is now bankrupt. They've come to the end of the road. In addition, was Barry Goldwater so irresponsible when he suggested that our government give up its program of deliberate planned inflation so that when you do get your Social Security pension, a dollar will buy a dollar's worth and not 45 cents worth? I think we're for an international organization where the nations of the world can seek peace. But I think we're against subordinating American interests to an organization that has become so structurally unsound that today you can muster a 2/3 vote on the floor of the General Assembly among nations that represent less than 10% of the world's population. I think we're against the hypocrisy of assailing our allies because here and there they cling to a colony, while we engage in a conspiracy of silence and never open our mouths about the millions of people enslaved in the Soviet colonies in the satellite nations. I think we're for aiding our allies by sharing of our material blessings with those nations which share in our fundamental beliefs. But we're against doling out money government to government, creating bureaucracy, if not socialism, all over the world. We set out to help 19 countries. We're helping 107. We've spent $146 billion. With that money, we bought a $2 million yacht for Haile Selassie. We bought dress suits for Greek undertakers, extra wives for Kenya government officials. We bought 1,000 TV sets for a place where they have no electricity. In the last 6 years, 52 nations have bought $7 billion worth of our gold, and all 52 are receiving foreign aid from this country. No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size, so government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. Federal employees number 2.5 million, and federal, state, and local, 1 out of 6 of the nation's workforce employed by government. These proliferating bureaus with their thousands of regulations have cost us many of our constitutional safeguards. How many of us realize that today federal agents can invade a man's property without a warrant? They can impose a fine without a formal hearing, let alone a trial by jury, and they can seize and sell his property at auction to enforce the payment of that fine. In Chico County, Arkansas, James Weir overplanted his rice allotment. The government obtained a $17,000 judgment, and a U.S. Marshal sold his 960-acre farm at auction. The government said it was necessary as a warning to others to make the system work. Last February 19th at the University of Minnesota, Norman Thomas, 6 times candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, said if Barry Goldwater became president, he would stop the advance of socialism in the United States. I think that's exactly what he will do. But as a former Democrat, I can tell you Norman Thomas isn't the only man who has drawn this parallel to socialism with the present administration. Because back in 1936, Mr. Democrat himself, Al Smith, the great American, came before the American people and charged that the leadership of his party was taking the party of Jefferson, Jackson, and Cleveland down the road under the banners of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. And he walked away from his party and he never returned till the day he died. Because to this day, the leadership of that party has been taking that party, that honorable party, down the road in the image of the Labor Socialist Party of England. Now, it doesn't require expropriation or confiscation of private property or business to impose socialism on a people. What does it mean whether you hold the deed to or the title to your business or property if the government holds the power of life and death over that business or property? And such machinery already exists. The government can find some charge to bring against any concern it chooses to prosecute. Every businessman has his own tale of harassment. Somewhere a perversion has taken place. Our natural unalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government. And freedom has never been so fragile, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment. Our Democratic opponents seem unwilling to debate these issues. They want to make you and I believe that this is a contest between two men, that we're to choose just between two personalities. Well, what of this man that they would destroy? And in destroying, they would destroy that which he represents, the ideas that you and I hold dear. Is he the brash and shallow and trigger-happy man they say he is? Well, I've been privileged to know him when. I knew him long before he ever dreamed of trying for high office. And I can tell you personally, I've never known a man in my life I believed so incapable of doing a dishonest or dishonorable thing. This is a man who in his own business, before he entered politics, instituted a profit-sharing plan before unions had ever thought of it. He put in health and medical insurance for all his employees. He took 50% of the profits before taxes and set up a retirement program, a pension plan for all his employees. He sent monthly checks for life to an employee who was ill and couldn't work. He provides nursing care for the children of mothers who work in the stores. When Mexico was ravaged by the floods in the Rio Grande, he climbed in his airplane and flew medicine and supplies down there. An ex-GI told me how he met him. It was the week before Christmas during the Korean War. And he was at the Los Angeles airport trying to get a ride home to Arizona for Christmas. And he said that a lot of servicemen there and no seats available on the planes. And then a voice came over the loudspeaker and said, any men in uniform wanting a ride to Arizona, go to runway such and such. And they went down there. There was a fellow named Barry Goldwater sitting in his plane. Every day in those weeks before Christmas, all day long, he'd load up the plane, fly it to Arizona, fly them to their homes, fly back over to get another load. During the hectic split-second timing of a campaign, this is a man who took time out to sit beside an old friend who was dying of cancer. His campaign managers were understandably impatient, but he said there aren't many left who care what happens to her. I'd like her to know I care. This is a man who said to his 19-year-old son, there is no foundation like the rock of honesty and fairness. And when you begin to build your life on that rock, with the cement of the faith in God that you have, then you have a real start. This is not a man who could carelessly send other people's sons to war. And that is the issue of this campaign that makes all the other problems I've discussed academic, unless we realize we're in a war that must be won. Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. This is the meaning, in the phrase of Barry Goldwater, peace through strength. Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronnie, for this very stirring speech. I am John Kilroy, National Chairman, TV for Goldwater Miller. I want to ask each of you, I want to ask each of you to take part in this important presidential campaign by contributing what you can to keep the Goldwater Crusade on the air. Send $1, $10, $50, or any amount to TV for Goldwater Miller, Box 80, Los Angeles 51. I repeat, TV Goldwater Miller, Box 80, Los Angeles 51.
The preceding pre-recorded political program was paid for by TV for Goldwater Miller on behalf of Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate for President of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm happy to be back in front of the Judiciary Committee where I started this pilgrimage. I am going to get even more fundamental than my good friend and colleague. Like him, I speak to students, especially law students, but also college students and even high school students, quite frequently about the Constitution. Because I feel that we're not teaching it very well. I speak to law students from the best law schools, people presumably especially interested in the law, and I ask them, how many of you have read the Federalist Papers? And well, a lot of hands will go out. No, not just number 48 and the big ones. How many of you have read the Federalist Papers, cover to cover? Never more than about 5%. And that is very sad. I mean, especially if you're interested in the Constitution. Here's a document that says what the framers of it thought they were doing. It's such a profound exposition of political science that it is studied in political science courses in Europe. And yet we have raised a generation of Americans who are not familiar with it. So when I speak to these groups, the first point I make, and I think it's even a little more fundamental than the one that Stephen has just put forward, I ask them, what do you think is the reason that America is such a free country? What is it in our Constitution that makes us what we are? And I guarantee you that the response I will get, and you will get this from almost any American, including the woman that he was talking to at the supermarket, the answer would be freedom of speech, freedom of the press, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no quartering of troops in hope, those marvelous provisions of the Bill of Rights. But then I tell them, if you think that a Bill of Rights is what sets us apart, you're crazy. Every banana republic in the world has a Bill of Rights. Every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. I mean it literally. It was much better. We guarantee freedom of speech and of the press. Big deal. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. Whoa, that is wonderful stuff. Of course, just words on paper, what our framers would have called a parchment guarantee. And the reason is that the real constitution of the Soviet Union, you think of the word constitution, it doesn't mean a bill, it means structure. Say a person has a sound constitution, has a sound structure. The real constitution of the Soviet Union, which is what our framers debated that whole summer in Philadelphia in 1787. They didn't talk about the Bill of Rights. That was an afterthought, wasn't it? That Constitution of the Soviet Union did not prevent the centralization of power in one person or in one party. And when that happens, the game is over. The Bill of Rights is just what our framers would call a parchment guarantee. So, the real key to the distinctiveness of America is the structure of our government. One part of it, of course, is the independence of the judiciary. But there's a lot more. There are very few countries in the world, for example, that have a bicameral legislature. Oh, England has a House of Lords for the time being, but the House of Lords has no substantial power. They can just make the Commons pass a bill a second time. France has a Senate, it's honorific. Italy has a Senate, it's honorific. Very few countries have two separate bodies in the legislature equally powerful. That's a lot of trouble, as you gentlemen doubtless know, to get the same language through two different bodies elected in a different fashion. Very few countries in the world have a separately elected chief executive. Sometimes I go to Europe to talk about separation of powers. And when I get there, I find that all I'm talking about is independence of the judiciary. Because the Europeans don't even try to divide the two political powers, the two political branches, the legislature and the chief executive. In all of the parliamentary countries, the chief executive is the creature of the legislature. There's never any disagreement between them and the prime minister, as there is sometimes between you and the president. When there's a disagreement, they just kick him out. They have a no confidence vote, a new election, and they get a prime minister who agrees with the legislature. And, the Europeans look at this system and they say, well, it passes one house, it doesn't pass the other house. Sometimes the other house is in the control of a different party. It passes both, and then this president who has a veto power vetoes it, and they look at this and they say, it is gridlock. And I hear Americans saying this nowadays, and there's a lot of it going around. They talk about a dysfunctional government because there's disagreement, and the framers would have said, yes, that's exactly the way we set it up. We wanted this to be power, contradicting power, because the main ill that beset us, as Hamilton said in The Federalist, when he talked about a separate Senate. He said, yes, it seems inconvenient, but inasmuch as the main ill that besets us is an excess of legislation, it won't be so bad. This is 1787. He didn't know what an excess of legislation was. So unless Americans can appreciate that and learn to love the separation of powers, which means learning to love the gridlock, which the framers believed would be the main protection of minorities. The main protection. If a bill is about to pass that really comes down hard on some minority, they think it's terribly unfair. It doesn't take much to throw a monkey wrench into this complex system. So Americans should appreciate that, and they should learn to love the gridlock. It's there for a reason, so that the legislation that gets out will be good legislation. And thus conclude my opening remarks.
Welcome back. We continue now with our rare exclusive interview with Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. In part two of our conversation, we discuss the recent controversies over statues and monuments in America, his love of the Constitution, and that small Justice Thomas exhibit finally added to the National African American Museum. There's a controversy because the Smithsonian Museum, African American Museum, for its first year, after it opened its doors, it had basically no reference to you except a reference to the confirmation battle. Did you think anything of that, or?
Not really. I mean, people who cared about me did, obviously, but no, not really. I mean, I grew up at a time when I was exposed to just wonderful range of ideas in a segregated library, in a black library, the Carnegie Library in Savannah. I mean, you might read George Schuyler in the Pittsburgh Courier, or you might read a book by, Ralph Ellison or Baldwin, or you might read one by Richard Wright. So you might read something about Booker T. Washington, but then W.B. Du Bois. So you had this range of ideas. And I think we're getting quite comfortable in our society limiting ideas and exposure to ideas. And maybe that's a symptom of it, I don't know. But I don't think it's good for the next generation and the people who will be learning. I mean, I think I learned a tremendous amount in the Carnegie Library simply from being exposed to a range of ideas. I mean, why would a little kid in Savannah, Georgia be reading Ayn Rand? Why? I mean, somebody exposed me to it. Somebody made the books available. Someone said it's okay for you to read that, and you should read it and learn from it.
Were any statues torn down during your time as a young boy in the South? Did you see any big historical monuments moved ever or taken down?
Well, I didn't see that much iconoclasm. I think there were all sorts of other problems.
Other problems with the...
But, you know, I think when I grew up and where I grew up in Savannah, the people I grew up with were a different people. I mean,
How so?
When you think of people like my grandparents, these were people who had been through quite a bit and had a calmness and a contentment about life, and they understood putting things in context, what was important, priorities, what battles are you going to fight today, what decisions you're going to make, what decisions you're going to make today will result in you being able to eat, those sorts of things. And long term, that these two boys they were raising will be educated and that they will have good manners and go to school and be polite to the neighbors, etc. I think that today we seem to think that everything has to be one size fits all and people can't have opinions that make us uncomfortable or ideas that make us uncomfortable or that we don't agree with. They would not tolerate that.
So your grandparents went through real segregation.
They went through
real racism, real racial hardship.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a plaque in your office with a quote on it that's attributed to your grandfather. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, my grandfather's favorite saying was, I mean, there were lots of opportunities in that environment to, as you could imagine, to want to say that you couldn't do certain things. And my grandfather, who was raised in part by his grandmother, who was a freed slave, and raised by an uncle, and his mother died when he was a young boy. So he was raised by his grandmother and his uncle later on. Well, when you would say to him you couldn't do something, his response was always the same. Old man Kant is dead. I helped bury him.
Old man Kant is dead. I helped bury him.
Yeah, and that was his view. He would say that to you when he got you up at 4 in the morning to go on the farm, and you said, I can't do this or do that. Old man Kant is dead.
That is, I wish I knew your grandfather.
Well, I wish a lot of people knew him, and I wish he was still here so I could thank him.
The fact that you raised a son and a nephew, what did you learn from that?
You know, I think you're raising kids. It is a humbling process.
Yeah, yeah.
And it gets increasingly humbling as they get older. And I think any parent who's raised kids will understand, will tell you it's humbling.
Are you shocked after all these years, after the 60s, you were in college? When did you graduate?
71.
Well, 71. Mm-hmm. Those are tumultuous times at Yale Law School. Are you surprised at how things are still so rancorous in the United States today about foundational issues? Yeah. Not about hot, but just foundational issues, the anthem and so forth.
No, I'm not surprised. I mean, what binds us? What do we all have in common anymore? And I think we have to think about that. I think this is, when I was a kid, even as we had laws that held us apart, there were things that we held dear and that we all had in common. And I think we always talk about the pluribus unum. What's our unum now? We have the pluribus, what's the unum? And I think it's a great country. I think we, for whatever reasons, have made it some people have decided that the Constitution isn't worth defending, that history isn't worth defending, that the culture and the principles aren't worth defending. Then, you know, certainly if you're in my position, they have to be worth defending. That's what keeps you going. That's what energizes you. That's what makes it the endeavor, all of the criticism, the other things. That's what makes it all acceptable, because what you're doing is so important and so critical to the things that matter. So I don't know what it is that we can say instinctively we have as a country in common.
It's great to see you. Thank you for making some time for us today.
And thank you, and good luck with your new show.
Thank you so much, Justice. It's easier than clerking for you. Just teasing.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, this may be the last time I speak on the House floor. At the end of the year, I'll leave Congress after 23 years in office over a 36-year period. My goals in 1976 were the same as they are today: promote peace and prosperity by a strict adherence to the principles of individual liberty. It was my opinion that the course of the U.S. embarked on in the latter part of the 20th century would bring us a major financial crisis and engulf us in a foreign policy that would overextend us and undermine our national security. To achieve these goals, I sought, the government would have had to shrink in size and scope, reduce spending, change the monetary system, and reject the unsustainable costs of policing the world and expanding the American empire. The problems seemed to be overwhelming and impossible to solve, yet from my viewpoint, just following the constraints placed on the federal government by the Constitution would have been a good place to start. Just how much did I accomplish? In many ways, according to conventional wisdom, my off and on career in Congress from 1976 to 2012 accomplished very little. No name legislation, no name federal buildings or highways, thank goodness. In spite of my efforts, the government has grown exponentially, taxes remain excessive, and the prolific increase of incomprehensible regulations continues. Wars are constant and pursued without congressional declaration. Deficits rise to the sky. Poverty is rampant, and dependency on the federal government is now worse than any time in our history. All this with minimal concerns for the deficits and unfunded liabilities that common sense tells us cannot go on much longer. A grand but never mentioned bipartisan agreement allows for the well-kept secret that keeps the spending going. One side doesn't give up 1 penny on military spending, the other side doesn't give up 1 penny on welfare spending, while both sides support the bailouts and the subsidies for the banking and the corporate elite. And the spending continues as the economy weakens and the downward spiral continues. As the government continues fiddling around, our liberties and our wealth burn in the flames of a foreign policy that makes us less safe. The major stumbling block to real change in Washington is the total resistance to admitting that the country is broke. This has made compromising just to agree to increase spending inevitable, since neither side has any intention on cutting spending. The country and the Congress will remain divisive since there's no loot left to divvy up. Without this recognition, the spenders in Washington will continue to march toward a fiscal cliff much bigger than the one anticipated this coming January. I've thought a lot about why those of us who believe in liberty as a solution have done so poorly in convincing others of its benefits. If liberty is what we claim it is, the principle that protects all personal, social, and economic decisions necessary for maximum prosperity and the best chance for peace, it should be an easy sell. Yet history has shown that the masses have been quite receptive to the promises of authoritarians, which are rarely, if ever, fulfilled. Should we have authoritarianism or liberty? If authoritarianism leads to poverty and war and less freedom for all individuals and is controlled by rich special interests, the people should be begging for liberty. There certainly was a strong enough sentiment for more freedom at the time of our founding that motivated those who were willing to fight in the revolution against the powerful British government. During my time in Congress, the appetite for liberty has been quite weak. The understanding of its significance negligible. Yet the good news is that compared to 1976, when I first came to Congress, the desire for more freedom and less government in 2012 is much greater and growing, especially in grassroots America. Tens of thousands of teenagers and college-age students are, with great enthusiasm, welcoming the message of liberty. I have a few thoughts as to why the people of a country like ours, once the freest and most prosperous, allowed the conditions to deteriorate to the degree that they have. Freedom, private property, and enforceable voluntary contracts generate wealth. In our early history, we were very much aware of this. But in the early part of the 20th century, our politicians promoted the notion that the tax and monetary system had to change. If we were to involve ourselves in excessive domestic and military spending, that is why Congress gave us the Federal Reserve and the income tax. The majority of Americans and many government officials agreed that sacrificing some liberty was necessary to carry out what some claim to be progressive ideas. Pure democracy became acceptable. They failed to recognize that what they were doing was exactly opposite of what the colonists were seeking when they broke away from the British. Some complain that my arguments make no sense, since great wealth and the standard of living improved for many Americans over the last 100 years, even with these new policies. But the damage to the market economy and the currency has been insidious and steady. It took a long time to consume our wealth, destroy the currency, and undermine productivity, and get our financial obligations to a point of no return. Confidence sometimes lasts longer than deserved. Most of our wealth today depends on debt. The wealth that we enjoyed and seemed to be endless allowed concern for the principle of a free society to be neglected. As long as most people believed the material abundance would last forever, worrying about protecting a competitive, productive economy and individual liberty seemed unnecessary. The age of redistribution. This neglect ushered in an age of redistribution of wealth by government, kowtowing to any and all special interests, except for those who just wanted to be left alone. That is why today, money in politics far surpasses money currently going into research and development and productive entrepreneurial efforts. The material benefits became more important than the understanding and promoting the principles of liberty and a free market. It is good that material abundance is a result of liberty, but materialism is all that we care. If materialism is all that we care about, problems are guaranteed. The crisis arrived because the illusion that wealth and prosperity would last forever has ended. Since it was based on debt and a pretense that debt can be papered over by an out-of-control fiat monetary system, it was doomed to fail. We have ended up with a system that doesn't produce enough even to finance the debt, and no fundamental understanding of why a free society is crucial to reversing these trends. If this is not recognized, the recovery will linger for a long time. Bigger government, more spending, more debt, more poverty for the middle class, and a more intense scramble by the elite special interests will continue. We need an intellectual awakening. Without an intellectual awakening, the turning point will be driven by economic law. A dollar crisis will bring the current out-of-control system to its knees. If it's not accepted that big government, fiat money, ignoring liberty, central economic planning, welfareism, and warfareism caused our crisis, we can expect a continuous and dangerous march toward corporatism and even fascism, with even more loss of our liberties. Prosperity for a large middle class, though, will become an abstract dream. This continuous move is no different than what we have seen in how our financial crisis of 2008 was handled. Congress first directed, with bipartisan support, bailouts for the wealthy. Then it was the Federal Reserve with its endless quantitative easing. If at first it doesn't succeed, try again. QE1, QE2, QE3, and with no results, we try QE indefinitely. That is, until it too fails. There is a cost to all of this, and let me assure you, delaying the payment is no longer an option. The rules of the market will extract its pound of flesh, and it won't be pretty. The current crisis elicits a lot of pessimism, and the pessimism adds to less confidence in the future. The two feed on themselves, making our situation worse. If the underlying cause of the crisis is not understood, we cannot solve our problems. The issue of warfare and welfare, deficits, inflationism and corporatism, bailouts and authoritarianism cannot be ignored. By only expanding these policies, we cannot expect good results. Everyone claims support for freedom, but too often it's for one's own freedoms and not for others. Too many believe that there must be limits on freedom. They argue that freedom must be directed and managed to achieve fairness and equality, thus making it acceptable to curtail through force certain liberties. Some decide what and whose freedoms to be limited. These are the politicians whose goal in life is power. Their success depends on gaining support from special interests. We don't need more isms. The great news is the answer is not to be found in more isms. The answers are to be found in more liberty, which costs so much less. Under these circumstances, spending goes down, wealth production goes up, and the quality of life improves. Just this recognition, especially if we move in this direction, increases optimism, which in itself is beneficial. The follow-through with sound policies are required, which must be understood and supported by the people. But there is good evidence that the generation coming of age at the present time is supportive of moving in the direction of more liberty and self-reliance. The more this change in direction and the solutions become known, the quicker will be our return to optimism. Our job for those of us who believe that a different system than the one that we had for the last 100 years has driven us to this unsustainable crisis is to be more convincing that there is a wonderful, uncomplicated, and moral system that provides the answers. We had a taste of it in our early history. We need not give up on the notion of advancing this cause. It worked, but we allowed our leaders to concentrate on the material abundance that freedom generates while ignoring freedom itself. Now we have neither, but the door is open out of necessity for an answer. The answer available is based on the Constitution, individual liberty, in prohibiting the use of government force to provide privileges and benefits to all special interests. After over 100 years, we face a society quite different from the one that was intended by the founders. In many ways, their efforts to protect future generations with the Constitution from this danger has failed. Skeptics at the time of the Constitution was written in 1787 warned us of today's possible outcome. The insidious nature of the erosion of our liberties and the reassurance our great abundance gave us allowed the process to evolve into a dangerous period in which we now live. Dependency on government largesse. Today, we face a dependency on government largesse for almost every need. Our liberties are restricted and government operates outside the rule of law, protecting and rewarding those who buy or coerce government into satisfying their demands. Here are a few examples. Undeclared wars are commonplace. Welfare for the rich and poor is considered an entitlement. The economy is overregulated, overtaxed, and grossly distorted by a deeply flawed monetary system. Debt is growing exponentially. The Patriot Act and FISA legislation passed without much debate have resulted in a steady erosion of our Fourth Amendment rights. Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people. The drone warfare we are pursuing worldwide is destined to end badly for us as the hatred builds for innocent lives lost and the international laws flaunted. Once we are financially weakened and militarily challenged, there will be a lot of resentment thrown our way. It's now the law of the land that the military can arrest American citizens, hold them indefinitely without charges or a trial. Rampant hostility toward free trade is supported by a large number in Washington. Supporters of sanctions, currency manipulation, and WTO trade retaliation call the true free traders isolationists. Sanctions are used to punish countries that don't follow our orders. Bailouts and guarantees of all kinds of misbehavior are routine. Central economic planning through monetary policy, regulations, and legislative mandates has been acceptable policy. I have a few questions. Excessive government has created such a mess, it prompts many questions. Why are sick people who use medical marijuana put in prison? Why does the federal government restrict the drinking of raw milk? Why can't American manufacturers rope and other products from hemp? Why are Americans not allowed to use gold and silver as legal tender as mandated by the Constitution? Why is Germany concerned enough to consider repatriating their gold held by the Fed for her in New York? Is it that the trust in the U.S. and dollar supremacy beginning to wane? Why do our political leaders believe it's necessary to thoroughly audit? Why do our political leaders believe it's unnecessary to thoroughly audit our own gold? Why can't Americans decide which type of light bulbs they can buy? Why is it the TSA permitted to abuse the rights of any American traveling by air? Why should there be mandatory sentences, even up to life, for crimes without victims, as our drug laws require? Why have we allowed the federal government to regulate commodes in our homes? Is it political suicide for anyone to criticize AIPAC? Why haven't we given up on the drug war, since it's an obvious failure and violates the people's rights? Has nobody noticed that the authorities can't even keep drugs out of the prisons? How can making our entire society a prison solve the problem? Why do we sacrifice so much getting necessarily involved in border disputes and civil strife around the world and ignore the root cause of the most dangerous, deadly border in the world, the one between Mexico and the United States? Why does Congress willingly give up its prerogatives to the executive branch? Why does changing the party in power never change policy? Could it be that the views of both parties are essentially the same? Why did the big banks, the large corporations, and foreign banks and foreign central banks get bailed out in 2008, and the middle class lost their jobs and their homes? Why do so many in the government and the federal officials believe that creating money out of thin air creates wealth? Why do so many accept the deeply flawed principle that government bureaucrats and politicians can protect us from ourselves without totally destroying the principle of liberty? Why can't people understand that war always destroys wealth and liberty? Why is there so little concern for the executive order that gives the president authority to establish a kill list, including American citizens, of those targeted for assassination? Why is patriotism thought to be blind loyalty to the government and the politicians who run it, rather than loyalty to the principles of liberty and support for the people? Real patriotism is a willingness to challenge the government when it's wrong. Why is it claimed that if people won't or can't take care of their own needs, that people in government are able to do it for them? Why did we ever give the government a safe haven for initiating violence against the people? Why do so many members defend free markets but not civil liberties? Why do so many members defend civil liberties but not free markets? Aren't they the same? Why don't more defend both economic liberty and personal liberty? Why are there not more individuals who seek to intellectually influence others to bring about positive changes those who seek power than those who seek power to force others to obey their commands. Why does the use of religion to support a social gospel and preemptive wars, both of which require authoritarians to use violence or the threat of violence, go unchallenged? Aggression and forced redistribution of wealth has nothing to do with the teachings of the world's great religions. Why do we allow the government and the Federal Reserve to disseminate false information dealing with both economic and foreign policy? Why is democracy held in such high esteem when it's the enemy of the minority and makes all rights relative to the dictates of the majority? Why should anyone be surprised that Congress has no credibility since there's such a disconnect between what politicians say and what they do? Is there any explanation for all the deception, the unhappiness, the fear of the future, the loss of confidence in our leaders, the distrust and the anger and frustration? Yes, there is. And there's a way to reverse these attitudes. The negative perceptions are logical and a consequence of bad policies bringing about our problems. Identification of the problems and recognizing the cause allow the proper changes to come easily. We should have more trust in ourselves, less in the government. Too many people have far too long placed too much confidence and trust in government and not enough in themselves. Fortunately, many are now becoming aware of the seriousness of the gross mistakes of the past several decades. The blame is shared by both political parties. Many Americans now are demanding to hear the plain truth of things and want the demagoguing to stop. Without this first step, solutions are impossible. Seeking the truth and finding the answers in liberty and self-reliance promotes the optimism necessary for restoring prosperity. The task is not that difficult if politics doesn't get in the way. We have allowed ourselves to get into such a mess for various reasons. Politicians deceive themselves as to how wealth is produced. Excessive confidence is placed in the judgment of politicians and bureaucrats. This replaces the confidence in a free society. Too many in high places of authority became convinced that only they, armed with arbitrary government power, can bring about fairness while facilitating wealth production. This always proves to be a utopian dream and destroys wealth and liberty. It impoverishes the people and rewards the special interests who end up controlling both parties. It's no surprise that much of what goes on in Washington is driven by aggressive partisanship and power seeking, with philosophic differences being minor. Economic ignorance is commonplace. Keynesianism continues to thrive, although today it is facing healthy, enthusiastic rebuttals. Believers in military Keynesianism and domestic Keynesianism continue to desperately promote their failed policy as the economy languishes in a deep slumber. Supporters of all government edicts use humanitarian arguments to justify them. Humanitarian arguments are always used to justify government mandates related to the economy, monetary policy, foreign policy, and personal liberty. This is on purpose to make it more difficult to challenge. But initiating violence for humanitarian reasons is still violence. Good intentions are no excuse and are just as harmful as when the people use and force with bad intentions. The results are always negative. The immoral use of force is the source of man's political problems. Sadly, many religious groups, secular organizations, and psychopathic authoritarians endorse government-initiated force to change the world. Even when the desired goals are well-intentioned, or especially when they're well-intentioned, the results are dismal. The good results sought never materialize. The new problems created require even more government force as a solution. The net result is institutionalizing government-initiated violence and morally justifying it on humanitarian grounds. This is the same fundamental reason our government uses force for invading other countries at will, central economic planning at home, and the regulation of personal liberty and habits of our citizens. It is rather strange that unless one has a criminal mind and no respect for other people and their property, no one claims it's permissible to go into one's neighbor's house and tell them how to behave, what they can eat, smoke, and drink, or how to spend their money. Yet, rarely is it asked why is it morally acceptable that a stranger with a badge and a gun can do the same thing in the name of law and order. Any resistance is met with brute force, fines, taxes, arrests, and even imprisonment. This is done more frequently every day without a search warrant. No government monopoly over initiating violence is what we need. Restraining aggressive behavior is one thing, but legalizing a government monopoly for initiating aggression can only lead to exhausting liberty associated with chaos, anger, and a breakdown of civil society. Permitting such authority and expecting a saintly behavior from the bureaucrats and the politicians is a pipe dream. We now have a standing army of armed bureaucrats in the TSA, CIA, FBI, Fish and Wildlife, FEMA, IRS, Corps of Engineers, etc., numbering over 100,000. Citizens are guilty until proven innocent in the unconstitutional administrative courts. Government in a free society should have no authority to meddle in the social activities or the economic transactions of individuals, nor should government meddle in the affairs of other nations. All things peaceful, even when controversial, should be permitted. We must reject the notion of prior restraint in economic activity, just as we do in the area of free speech and religious liberty. But even in these areas, government is starting to use a backdoor approach of political correctness to regulate speech, a very dangerous trend. Since 9/11, monitoring speech on the internet is now a problem since warrants are no longer required. The proliferation of federal crimes. The Constitution established 4 federal crimes. Today, the experts can't even agree on how many federal crimes are now on the books. They number into the thousands. No one person can comprehend the enormity of the legal system, especially the tax code. Due to the ill-advised drug wars and the endless federal expansion of the criminal code, we have over 6 million people under correctional suspension, more than the Soviets ever had and more than any other nation today, including China. I don't understand the complacency of the Congress and the willingness to continue their obsession with passing more federal laws. Mandatory sentencing laws associated with drug laws have compounded our prison problems. The Federal Register is now 75,000 pages long and the tax code 72,000 pages and expands every year. When will the people start shouting, enough is enough, and demand Congress to cease and desist? What we should be doing is achieving liberty. Liberty can only be achieved when government is denied the aggressive use of force. If one seeks liberty, a precise type of government is needed. To achieve it, more than lip service is required. There are 2 choices available. 1, a government designed to protect liberty is a natural right as its sole objective. The people are expected to care for themselves and reject the use of any force for interfering with another person's liberty. Government is given a strictly limited authority to enforce contracts, property ownerships, settles disputes, and defend against foreign aggression. Number 2, a government that pretends to protect liberty but is granted power to arbitrarily use force over the people and foreign nations. Though the grant of power many times is meant to be small and limited, it inevitably metastasizes into an omnipotent political cancer. This is the problem for which the world has suffered throughout the ages. Though meant to be limited, it nevertheless is a 100% sacrifice of the principle that would-be tyrants find irresistible. It is used vigorously, though incrementally and insidiously. Granting power to government officials always proves the adage that power corrupts. Once government gets a limited concession for the use of force to mold people's habits and plan the economy, it causes a steady erosion and a steady move toward tyrannical government. Only a revolutionary spirit can reverse the process and deny the government this arbitrary use of aggression. There is no in between. Sacrificing a little liberty for imaginary safety always ends badly. Today's mess is a result of Americans accepting option number 2, even though the founders attempted to give us option number 1. The results are not good. As our liberties have been eroded, our wealth has been consumed. The wealth we see today is based on debt and a foolish willingness on the part of foreigners to take our dollars for goods and services. Then they loan them back to us to perpetuate our debt system. It's amazing that it has worked for this long, but the impasse in Washington in solving our problems indicate that many are starting to understand the seriousness of this worldwide debt crisis and the dangers we face. The longer this process continues, the harsher the outcome will be. The financial crisis is actually a moral crisis. Many are acknowledging that a financial crisis looms, but few understand it's in reality a moral crisis. It's the moral crisis that has allowed our liberties to be undermined and permits the exponential growth of illegal government power. Without a clear understanding of the nature of the crisis, it will be difficult to prevent a steady march toward tyranny and the poverty that will accompany it. Ultimately, the people have to decide which form of government they want, option number 1 or option number 2. There is no other choice. Claiming there is a choice of a little tyranny is like describing pregnancy as a touch of pregnancy. It is a myth to believe that a mixture of free markets and government central economic planning is a worthy compromise. What we see today is a result of that type of thinking, and the results speak for themselves. A culture of violence. Americans now suffer from a culture of violence. It is easy to reject the initiation of violence against one's neighbor, but it's ironic that the people arbitrarily and freely anoint government officials with monopoly power to initiate violence against the American people, practically at will. Because it's the government that initiates force, most people accept it as being legitimate. Those who exert the force have no sense of guilt. It is believed by too many, that governments are morally justified in initiating violence supposedly to do good. They incorrectly believe that this authority has come from the consent of the people. The minority, or victims of government violence, never consented to suffer the abuse of government mandates, even when dictated by the majority. Victims of TSA excesses never consented to this abuse. This attitude has given us a policy of initiating war to do good as well. It is claimed that war to prevent war for noble purposes is justified. This is similar to what we were once told that, quote, destroying a village to save a village, close quote, was justified. It was said by a U.S. Secretary of State that the loss of 500,000 Iraqis, mostly children, in the 1990s as a result of American bombs and sanctions was worth it to achieve the good we brought to the people of Iraq. And look at the mess that Iraq is in today. Government use of force to mold social and economic behavior at home and abroad has justified individuals using force on their own terms. The fact that violence by government is seen as morally justified is the reason why violence will increase when the big financial crisis hits and becomes a political crisis as well. First, we recognize that individuals shouldn't initiate violence. Then we give the authority to the government. Eventually, the immoral use of government violence, when things go badly, will be used to justify an individual's right to do the same thing. Neither the government nor individuals have the moral right to initiate violence against another, yet we are moving toward the day when both will claim this authority. If this cycle is not reversed, society will break down. When needs are pressing and conditions deteriorate and rights become relative to the demands and the whims of the majority, it's then not a great leap for individuals to take it upon themselves to use violence to get what they claim is theirs. As the economy deteriorates and the wealth discrepancy increase, as they already are occurring, violence increases as those in need take it in their own hands to get what they believe is theirs. They will not wait for a government rescue program. When government officials wield power over others to bail out the special interests, even with disastrous results to the average citizens, they feel no guilt for the harm they do. Those who take us into undeclared wars, with many casualties resulting, never lose sleep over the deaths and the destruction their bad decisions caused. They are convinced that what they do is morally justified, and the fact that many suffer just can't be helped. When the street criminals do the same thing, they too have no remorse, believing that they are only taking what is rightfully theirs. All moral standards become relative, whether it's bailouts, privileges, government subsidies, or benefits for some from inflating a currency. It's all part of a process justified by a philosophy of forced redistribution of wealth. Violence or a threat of such is the instrument required, and unfortunately is of little concern of most members of Congress. Some argue it's only a matter of fairness, that those in need are cared for. There are two problems with this. First, the principle is used to provide a greater amount of benefits to the rich than to the poor. Second, no one seems to be concerned about whether or not it's fair to those who end up paying for all the benefits. The costs are usually placed on the backs of the middle class and are hidden from the public eye. Too many people believe government handouts are free, like printing money out of thin air and there's no cost. That deception is coming to an end. The bills are coming due, and that's what the economic slowdown is all about. Sadly, we have become accustomed to living with the illegitimate use of force by government. It is the tool for telling the people how to live, what to eat and drink, what to read, and how to spend their money. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected. Granting to government even a small amount of force is a dangerous concession. Limiting government excesses versus a virtuous moral people. Our Constitution, which was intended to limit government power and abuse, has failed. The founders warned that a free society depends on a virtuous and moral people. The current crisis reflects that their concerns were justified. Many politicians and pundits are aware of the problems we face, but spend all their time in trying to reform government. The sad part is that the suggested reforms almost always leads to less freedom, and the importance of a virtuous and moral people is either ignored or not understood. The new reforms serve only to further undermine liberty. The compounding effect has given us the steady erosion of liberty and the massive expansion of debt. The real question is, if it is liberty we seek, should most of the emphasis be placed on government, reform, or trying to understand what a virtuous and moral people means and how to promote it? The Constitution has not prevented the people from demanding handouts for both rich and poor in their efforts to reform the government, while ignoring the principles of a free society. All branches of our government today are controlled by individuals who use their power to undermine liberty and enhance the welfare-warfare state, and frequently their own wealth and power. If the people are unhappy with the government performance, it must be recognized that government is merely a reflection of an immoral society that rejected a moral government of constitutional limits on power and love of freedom. If this is the problem, all the tinkering with thousands of pages of new laws and regulations will do nothing to solve the problem. It is self-evident that our freedoms have been severely limited, and the apparent prosperity we still have is nothing more than leftover wealth from a previous time. This fictitious wealth based on debt and benefits from a false trust in our currency and credit will play havoc with our society when the bills come due. This means that the full consequence of our lost liberties is yet to be felt. But that illusion is now ending. Reversing a downward spiral depends on accepting a new approach. Expect the rapidly expanding homeschooling movement to play a significant role in the revolutionary reforms needed to rebuild a free society with constitutional protections. We cannot expect a federal government-controlled school system to provide the intellectual ammunition to combat the dangerous growth of government that threatens our liberties. The internet will provide the alternative to the government media complex that controls the news and most political propaganda. This is why it's essential that the internet remains free of government regulation. Many of our religious institutions and secular organizations support greater dependency on the state by supporting war, welfare, and corporatism, and ignore the need for a virtuous people. I never believed that the world or our country could be made more free by politicians if the people had no desire for freedom. Under the current circumstances, the most we can hope to achieve in the political process is to use it as a podium to reach the people, to alert them of the nature of the crisis and the importance of their need to assume responsibility for themselves. If it is liberty that they truly seek, without this, a constitutionally protected free society is impossible. If this is true, our individual goal in life ought to be for us to seek virtue and excellence and recognize that self-esteem and happiness only comes from using one's natural ability in the most productive manner possible, according to one's own talents. Productivity and creativity are the true source of personal satisfaction. Freedom and not dependency provides the environment needed to achieve these goals. Government cannot do this for us. It only gets in the way. When the government gets involved, the goal becomes a bailout or a subsidy, and these cannot provide a sense of personal achievement. Achieving legislative power and political influence should not be our goal. Most of the change, if it is to come, will not come from the politicians, but rather from individuals, family, friends, intellectual leaders, and our religious institutions. The solution can only come from rejecting the use of coercion, compulsion, government commands, and aggressive force to mold social and economic behavior. Without accepting these restraints, inevitably the consensus will be to allow the government to mandate economic equality and obedience to the politicians who gain power and promote an environment that smothers the freedoms of everyone. It is then that the responsible individuals who seek excellence and self-esteem by being self-reliant and productive become the victims. In conclusion, what are the greatest dangers that the American people face today that impede the goal of a free society? There are 5. The continuous attack on our civil liberties, which threaten the rule of law and our ability to resist the onrush of tyranny. Number 2, violent anti-Americanism that has engulfed the world. Because the phenomenon of blowback is not understood or denied, our foreign policy is destined to keep us involved in many wars that we have no business being in. National bankruptcy and a greater threat to our national security will result. Number 3, the ease in which we go to war, without a declaration by Congress, but accepting international authority from the UN or NATO, even for preemptive wars, otherwise known as aggression. A financial political crisis as a Number 4, a financial political crisis as a consequence of excessive debt, unfunded liabilities, spending, bailouts, and gross discrepancy in wealth distribution, going from the middle class to the rich. The danger of central economic planning by the Federal Reserve must be understood. World government taking over local and U.S. sovereignty by getting involved in the issues of war, welfare, trade, banking, a world currency, taxes, property, ownership, and private ownership of guns must be addressed. Happily, there's an answer for these very dangerous trends. What a wonderful world it would be if everyone accepted the simple moral premise of rejecting all acts of aggression. The retort to such a suggestion is always, it's too simplistic, too idealistic, impractical, naive, utopian, dangerous, and unrealistic to strive for such an ideal. The answer to that is that for thousands of years, the acceptance of government force to rule over the people at the sacrifice of liberty was considered moral and the only available option for achieving peace and prosperity. What could be more utopian than that myth? Considering the results, especially looking at the state-sponsored killing by nearly every government during the 20th century, estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of people, it's time to reconsider this grant of authority to the state. No good has ever come from granting monopoly power to the state to use aggression against the people to arbitrarily mold human behavior. Such power, when left unchecked, becomes the seed of an ugly tyranny. This method of governance has been adequately tested, and the results are in. The reality dictates we try liberty. The idealism of non-aggression and rejecting the offensive use of force should be tried. The idealism of government-sanctioned violence has been abused throughout history and is the primary source of poverty and war. The theory of a society being based on individual freedom has been around for a long time. It's time to take a bold step and actually permit it by advancing this cause rather than taking a step backwards as some would like us to do today. Today, the principles of habeas corpus, established when King John signed the Magna Carta in 1215, is under attack in our own government. There's every reason to believe that a renewed effort with the use of the internet, that we can instead advance the cause of liberty by spreading an uncensored message that will serve to rein in government authority and challenge the obsession with war and welfare. What I'm talking about is a system of government guided by the moral principles of peace and tolerance. The founders were convinced that a free society could not exist without a moral people. Just writing rules won't work if the people choose to ignore them. Today, the rule of law written in the Constitution has little meaning for most Americans, especially those who work in Washington, D.C. Benjamin Franklin claimed, quote, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom." John Adams concurred, quote, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." A moral people must reject all violence in an effort to mold people's beliefs or habits. A society that boos or ridicules the golden rule is not a moral society. All great religions endorse the golden rule. The same moral standards that individuals are required to follow should apply to all government officials. They cannot be exempt. The ultimate solution is not in the hands of the government. The solution falls on each and every individual with guidance from family, friends, and community. The number one responsibility for each of us is to change ourselves with hope that others will follow. This is of greater importance than the working on changing the government. That is secondary to promoting a virtuous society. If we can achieve this, then the government will change. It doesn't mean that political action or holding office has no value. At times, it does nudge policy in the right direction. But what is true is that when seeking office is done for personal aggrandizement, money, or power, it becomes useless if not harmful. When political action is taken for the right reasons, it's easy to understand why compromise should be avoided. It's also become clear why progress is best achieved by working with coalitions, which bring people together without anyone sacrificing his principles. Political action, to be truly beneficial, must be directed toward changing the hearts and minds of the people, recognizing that it's virtue and morality of the people that allow liberty to flourish. The Constitution or moral laws per se have no value if the people's attitudes aren't changed. To achieve liberty and peace, two powerful human emotions have to be overcome. Number one is envy, which leads to hate and class warfare. Number two is intolerance, which leads to bigoted and judgmental policies. These emotions must be replaced with a much better understanding of love, compassion, tolerance, and free market economics. Freedom, when understood, brings people together. When tried, freedom is popular. The problem we have faced over the years has been that economic interventionists are swayed by envy, whereas social interventionists are swayed by intolerance or of habits and lifestyles. The misunderstanding that tolerance is an endorsement of certain activity motivates many to legislate moral standards which should only be set by individuals making their own choices. Both sides use force to deal with these misplaced emotions. Both are authoritarians. Neither endorses voluntarism. Both views ought to be rejected. I have come to one firm conviction after these many years of trying to figure out the plain truth of things. The best chance for achieving peace and prosperity for the maximum number of people worldwide is to pursue the cause of liberty. If you find this to be a worthwhile message, spread it throughout the land. And I yield back the balance of my time.
It's back.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, Justice Thomas, who is in the room downstairs, distinguished guests and colleagues. Thank you for joining the Law Library of Congress and the United States Supreme Court today for the 2018 Supreme Court Fellows Program Annual Lecture. My name is Jane Sanchez, and I have the honor of serving as the 25th Law Librarian of Congress. A little bit about the library. The Law Library serves as the nation's custodian of a legal and legislative collection of nearly 3 million items from all countries and legal systems of the world. Our foreign law specialists are a diverse group of foreign-trained attorneys who provide information and analysis on over 270 jurisdictions in the world. Our skilled law library staff, both American-trained attorneys and law librarians, also provide research assistance and reference services on U.S. federal and state legal issues. While our collections and our expertise reach across all points of the globe, for today's event, we've partnered with our next-door neighbor, who happens to be the highest court in the country. By the way, they are pretty good neighbors. They're quiet, and they keep to themselves pretty much. This afternoon, we are pleased to be able to collaborate with the Supreme Court as they celebrate their 45th year of the Fellows Program. Please note that today's program is being live streamed on the Library of Congress YouTube channel, so all sounds, images, and remarks will be captured on video. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones and refrain from taking photos on any devices throughout the event. For that, we would thank you. At this time, I would like to invite to the stage Jeffrey P. Menier, Executive Director of the Supreme Court Fellows Program and Counselor to the Chief Justice of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for the warm introduction. And thanks to you and the Law Library of Congress for your partnership with the Supreme Court Fellows Program in sponsoring this afternoon's event. Since its creation in 1832, when the great John Marshall was still serving as Chief Justice, the Law Library has been an important resource and steady friend of the court. We could not ask for a better neighbor than the largest law library in the world, and they're pretty quiet, too. Let me say just a word about the Supreme Court Fellows Program in my capacity as its Executive Director. Each year, the Supreme Court Fellows Commission, made up of judges and other legal leaders appointed by the Chief Justice, selects 4 talented professionals to spend a year within the federal judiciary participating in court administration while engaging in research and other enrichment opportunities. This afternoon's event is the public component of 2 days of activities in which we celebrate our current Supreme Court Fellows and bring together 45 years of Fellows Program alumni. Over the course of today and tomorrow, we'll select next year's Fellows from the superb finalists who are with us this afternoon. I understand we have many law students with us in the audience today, as well as law clerks from several courts in the federal and state systems. If you have an interest in how federal courts work, I hope you will take the time to learn more about the fellowship program and consider applying in a future year. I invite you to visit our website at fellows.supremecourt.gov. Applications for the 2019-2020 class will be due in November. But before you set to work on your applications, we have a great feature this afternoon. We have as our distinguished guest the 105th Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, the Honorable Clarence Thomas, who has served on the court since 1991. 10 years ago, Justice Thomas published his best-selling autobiography, My Grandfather's Son. That book shared, in the Justice's own words, his remarkable American story. I commend it to anyone seeking a compelling read. We have the book available for purchase both here and at the Supreme Court gift shop. We are fortunate to have with us also the Honorable Gregory Maggs, to moderate today's conversation. When we planned this program, Greg was a professor at George Washington University Law School, but in the past month has received his judicial commission as a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. Judge Maggs was a law clerk to Justice Thomas in 1991, and before that to Justice Anthony Kennedy. Please join me in welcoming Justice Thomas and Judge Maggs.
Thank you.
Do you feel comfortable, Justice?
No. This is not the most suitable position for introverts. You can ask it. We like to be in the shadows someplace.
We were having a great time backstage.
Oh, yeah, it was just fine back there. Don't you all have anything to do? Oh, my goodness. Sorry, you all are dragging yourselves out on this day.
Justice, Mr. Menier mentioned that it is the 10th anniversary of your publication of your book, My Grandfather's Son.
I have forgotten about that.
And I thought I'd start by just asking you a few questions about the book.
So you're Judge Maggs now, huh?
As about a week, that's right.
I think that's great. I'm just changing the subject.
Justice, you start out the book when you're 9 years old. Why is that the place to start your autobiography?
You know, I had the manuscript to that, and Terry Teachout, who was my final editor, was just a phenomenal human being, and editor and musician, and he understood. He dug deep into the manuscript and he said, you know, you have a great title. I had picked out the title to My Grandfather's Son. And he said, but you have to explain the title within the first page or two. And he said, I found the explanation buried in your manuscript. And the line is, I was 9 years old when I met my father. And he said that most people wouldn't think of that, because ultimately my grandfather is my father. So I'm my grandfather's son, not my father's son. So that was my first encounter that I remember with my father. And so that's why I started it out there, to explain why I was my grandfather's son.
Life didn't start out too easy. You mentioned in the book that you grew up in Pinpoint, and then when you're in a home which didn't have water, it didn't have electricity. When the house burned down, you moved to Savannah, and conditions got worse. I think you write that in the winter of 1995, you remember being hungry.
1955.
1955.
Yeah, boy, I was doing fine in 1995.
1955, you were hungry without knowing when you would eat, and cold without knowing when you would be warm.
That's a horrible feeling. But you know, today I just get worn down. I was with a young woman who happened to be black in Kansas recently, and she said something really interesting. She said, I'm really tired of having to play the role of being black. I just want to go to school. And I think at some point, we're going to be fatigued with everybody being a victim. When I was a kid, there were tons of people who were in really bad circumstances. My grandfather would not let us wallow in that. And as you could tell throughout this book, he's my hero. He is the single greatest human being I've ever met. With 9 months of education, but he never saw himself as a victim. He used to say that he was a motherless child. He never knew his father. His mother died when he was 7 or 8 years old. Of course, they didn't have birth certificates then, so he never knew quite how old he was. And then he was raised by his grandmother, who was a freed slave. Then she dies, and then he lives with an uncle who has 12 or 13 kids and who was a hard man. And yet, he never complained. And he always said, he would have this saying when you'd want to whine or something. He said, you know, you have to play the hand you're dealt. He'd always said, in those days, blacks played bid whist a lot. And he'd say, you always have to play the hand you're dealt. If you're dealt a bad hand, you still have to play it. And when we would whine about things, if you look at the bust in my office that my wonderful wife had made for me when I went on the court, his favorite quote was, "Old man Kant is dead, I helped bury him." That is what I grew up with. That was in, I don't know if you saw the movie The Help. That's my family. We were the help. My mother made $10 a week, $5 more if you had car fare. Miss Mariah was a maid. My mother was a maid. My grandmother had been a maid. Miss Beck was a maid. Cousin B was a maid. Cousin Dosha was a maid. You see what I'm saying? Everybody, all of them were maids. And they were the help. And yet they never, ever complained. And life was hard. I mean, the things that we consider hard today. I had some college students ask me a few years back, how would I explain, talk to them now that the economy had taken a downturn? And I said, and I'm looking at them, and I said, how many of you don't have cell phones? Of course, they all had cell phones. How many of you don't have a computer? They all had computers. How many of you don't have a car? I think all but one had a car. I said, you're so far above the poverty line. And when I was in school, you were at the poverty line. You're making like 90 cents an hour. You had no money. You had no shoes or any, you had like boots and things like that. And you didn't worry about it because virtually everybody was there. And so when the economy took a downturn, when you're on the floor, isn't a whole lot further you can go. And for them, they're losing from up here to maybe midway down. So I really had no connection with them. But my further point, I didn't have a radio. I didn't have a telephone. And they're complaining, and I certainly didn't have a car. But it wasn't a problem because you had your dreams. You had your energy. You had more than the people you grew up around. I grew up around a world of total illiteracy. That's the beauty. I'm in the Library of Congress. Total illiteracy. But the thing that they had was this hope that the next generation would learn how to read. They knew how important it was for me. So my grandfather wouldn't let me I was a really good athlete too. I don't like to say that because then people want you to kind of show that you were a great athlete. And it's kind of too late in the day now. But he would not give us time off to play sports. We worked on the oil truck or on the farm. But if it had to do with the library, you could do it. So at night, he would let me go to the Carnegie Library, where I'd started going in the summer of 1955 for the noble reason that summer 55, I was 7 years old. And we just moved into this little tenement on the east side. And on Saturday, they gave you cookies and juice. So I went for the very high-minded reason of getting cookie and juice. And when you live in these neighborhoods, cookies and juice are a real treat. Along the way, they introduce you to Dr. Seuss. And if I hear "See Spot Run" one more time, but it was over. It was wonderful. And you got cookies and juice. But it gave me this image of the library as this place to learn. And it became a haven. So I walk in here. I said, look where I am. I come from this world of illiteracy, place where they treasured learning, and I get to be in a place of learning with all the books and all the people who are literate. So that's a long way of saying I was very fortunate to grow up around people who saw beyond their circumstances and who refused to be limited by those circumstances or to wallow in the sort of victim status of their circumstances.
Tell me more about your grandfather. He was a very strict man. Was he unfair?
Oh, God, no. No. And people said, they ask sometimes about the nuns and my grandfather, did you, because in those days you had corporal punishment. And they said, well, did you get, like, beatings? I said, yeah, but not as many as I deserved. And my grandfather, whenever he gave you one that he found out was unfair, that you didn't deserve it at that time, he said, well, that's for what you got away with. And then you couldn't, what do you say? Because you knew you got away with stuff. And every one of us knew, oh boy, I'm glad he didn't get me on that one. But no, my grandfather was a hard man, but not a harsh man. Life was hard. I mean, anybody in this room who grew up in that environment, that is a hard life where you have to figure out how you're going to put a meal on the table, where there's a very fine line between you not being able to eat today and being able to eat. And the gratitude, we always said grace before and after meal. We're Catholic. And he would always be grateful. And this is the old porcelain top table. My grandfather sat here. I always sat facing him. I don't know why I got that position where he would just stare at you. I'm like, God, help me. So, and then my grandmother sat here and my brother sat there on this small table. And he would always say, we are grateful that we have food on our table, clothes on our back, and a roof over our head. And it doesn't get much better than that. So he was never unfair. He was very generous. What he would do is, let's say, he would make us work to produce something. Then he would say, we are able to provide for others because we work. So we're able to give them corn or beans or peas or syrup or sugar canes or fruit because we work. We are able to give them meat because we raise the hogs. So what he taught us was we had an obligation to do well so that we could do good, particularly for others. So I could not call that fair. I think my grandfather was probably one of the most compassionate people I've ever known because he always told us the truth. He always told us the truth about life. And so I asked my brother unfortunately died 18 years ago jogging. He was a year and 4 months younger, and he and I grew up with my grandparents. And I asked him when we were in our 40s, we were very close, and I said, do you think my grandfather, when we went to live with him in 55, said, I will never tell you to do as I say. I will always tell you to do as I do. Watch me. And so I asked my brother years later, after my grandfather was long gone, was he ever a hypocrite? And my brother said, absolutely not. That he lived up to that. Think about that. Would you set yourself up as the model and the example to your own children? And all you do is you said, do as I do. Watch me every day. And we watched him, because he would never let us out of his sight. And when he did let you out of his sight, it was with the nuns. Or I could get away from him to the library. I loved the library. You know, we take it for granted now because we have all these computers and all that stuff. But just think of yourself coming from a house with no books, and you get to walk into this world and had Encyclopedia Americana, Encyclopedia Britannica. It had Webster. It had Funk and Wagnall. It had all sorts of fiction. You know, it had magazines, Look, Life, Time, all the newspapers. It was like the smorgasbord every time you walked in. And you had the reference librarians who would introduce you to new things. Then they introduced you to National Geographic, so you were all over the world. And this is all in Savannah, Georgia. And remember, this is a world of segregation. So it gave you this window to everything else. It gave you a window beyond Georgia. And the nuns encouraged it, the librarians encouraged it. So I had an opportunity some years ago to go back and to write and thank all the librarians. And most recently, I ran into a lady in Savannah, an elderly white lady, because I was among the early kids who went to the Savannah Public Libraries, desegregated. And I was kind of a nuisance there, too, because I kept showing up. It was like I was, where's Waldo? Where's Clarence? He's got to be here someplace. And I remember it's a time to get away from my grandfather. And it was just this amazing world. And I ran into this elderly white lady, and she started crying. And she said, I helped you at the Savannah Public Library. And I said, oh my gosh, it was really kind of emotional because I remember how scared I was. You had to cross in those days a lot of lines, but going to the library was worth doing that. Anyway, that's the library.
Tell me more about your Catholic education and your decision to go to seminary.
You know, I look back, I used to ask Justice Scalia about that. He always thought it was interesting that we were so similar. He would say, Clarence, he said, my father was a Romance literature professor, my mother was a teacher, so I know how I got here. How did you get here? And why are we at the same place? Why do we have the same set of beliefs? And I think the beauty of having gone to parochial schools was they taught us there was a right way to think about things, that we had to be honest with ourselves, honest about math, honest about physics, honest about chemistry, that you couldn't cheat when you did your Latin translations, or German or French, because I had all those in high school. And I was talking recently with someone, he said it was your formation, that there was always a right way to do things. There was an honest way to do things. And the progression is, I became Catholic when I went to the second grade in 1955. Sister Mary Dolorosa, sister, and wonderful person. So at any rate, I became an altar boy. And the progression is you become an altar boy, and if you progress as an altar boy, you consider whether or not you have a vocation. And in those days, you went to a minor seminary. So in 1964, I decided that I thought I had a vocation. So I was 15, and then the following year, when I was 16, I went to the seminary. The difficulty was, again, things hadn't been desegregated yet. So you were, again, crossing these racial barriers. So you had that challenge. But to be honest with you, even that was not nearly as difficult as going to school in New England. There were a few jerks, we all have those, but beyond that, the school was excellent. The people were fair to me. It was very, very challenging academically. And also I like to say I finished in the top 10 of my high school class, because there were only 9 of us. But hey, you have to take these things where you get them. That'll be the last time I'd be able to say that.
What about your decision to leave the seminary?
Well, that was 1968. Any of us who were around in 1968, it was 1968. The wheels were coming off the wagons in a lot of ways. And the little Catholic kid from the rather insular world of Savannah suddenly was reading, and it was a long, hot, Dr. King was assassinated. We became quite race conscious, which has some problematic sides as good sides. And I think a lot of us, you went from being the nice Catholic kid to the angry black kid. And that was 1968. So then I returned home and was greeted with my grandfather, who told me that if I'm going to do that, then I need to find out another place to live. So kicked me out of the house, and I was on my own. I was 19 years old. That was May 1968.
But you went to Holy Cross.
I know there's all this myth about how I went, and people love to come up with narratives and myths. They should read the Aeneid or something. But at any rate, my chemistry teacher asked a high school, a classmate of mine, to send me an application. I had ranked very high in my class in seminary, first year college, and I just simply filled it out and I transferred to Holy Cross. I was accepted almost immediately and transferred to Holy Cross in 1968. So I wasn't going to go because I was tired of being the only black kid, or one or two or three, and I was going to go to Savannah State. But then when my grandfather disinvited me from living in his house, I thought it might not be a good idea to hang around. So I just, I hadn't really thought about any other school, so I had been accepted to Holy Cross, so I got on the train and went to Holy Cross. You can see all the planning I did. And so that's why I say to people, my whole life has been providential, because I certainly didn't know what was going on.
In your book, Justice, you talk about being a radical at Holy Cross, about being angry. Did you feel you were being treated unfairly?
At Holy Cross?
Yeah.
No, I was just mad at the world. I mean, it was 1968. I was angry. I mean, I didn't need a logical reason to be angry. I was angry about things that happened in the past. I was angry about things that were going to happen in the future. If you said good morning to me, I was angry. If you didn't say good morning, I was angry. So I was angry. And people sort of exploited that. And, I remember going to Harvard Square and in April 15, 1970, and we were pretty upset. I couldn't explain to myself why I just did that. All night we were rioting, and I got back home, got back to Holy Cross, and that's when I made a promise to God that I would never, that if He took anger out of my heart, I would never do that again. I would never let anger control my life. That was the morning of April 16, 1970, and I've attempted to live up to that.
What made you choose law?
It's kind of the Forrest Gump effect, How do I know? I was going to be a priest, and when you have a vocation, you think the belief is God is calling you, and that's the only dream I've ever had, was to be a priest. I don't think it ever quite leaves you. And when I went off to Holy Cross, I was in a little bit of a tailspin. So I was looking for the next call. What am I called to do? So I decided that God would call me to go to Savannah and to help out. And one way to do that was to be in law. And so I went to law school to return to Savannah. So if you notice, I've never really worked in a law firm. I worked in a small firm in Savannah, Georgia, in the summer of between second and third year law school, because I wanted to return to Savannah. For reasons that I'm not going to get into, that job did not live up to my expectations. Now I've got a wife. Today's my son's 45th birthday. So he was a little kid. And I had a wife and child and student loans. And now I need a job, because I'm not going back to this situation that I don't think is right in Savannah. And I couldn't get a job in Savannah, Georgia. That's literally it. I couldn't get a job in Atlanta, Georgia. I couldn't get a job in Washington, D.C. I couldn't get a job in New York, and I couldn't get a job in L.A. I mean, I struck out every place I could. So I wound up in Jefferson City, Missouri. And because they didn't give me a job in Atlanta is the reason I wound up on the court. So it's their fault. Otherwise, I would be comfortably a tax lawyer or something.
Tell me about your years at Yale.
What about it?
Do you remember them?
Thanks for that. I think that was ageism.
No. That was a slight on Yale. That was all it was.
You can see I've always enjoyed my law clerks. And we enjoyed teaching together. We've been teaching together for 6 or 7 years at GW Law School, and we've had a total blast. It's a good thing they don't really pay us for it. Or you're not going to get paid now because you're going to be adjunct like the rest of us. You know, Yale was the perfect school for me. I've had my complaints for reasons after Yale, but Yale showed me where I needed to be. If I went back to Yale, I would go differently today. I wouldn't go with all these burdens of anger and bitterness and self-restrictions and constraint. I would spend a lot of time in the Sterling Library, which I loved being in. I would spend a lot of time doing the things that I like. I'd be like that young kid at KU. I just want to go to school. I just want to be a kid. I like chamber music. I'd go to that. I like debates. I like recitals. You know, I'm reading a book now on the Plantagenets. You know, Kagan was at Yale. I should have gone to those lectures for you know, whether it's Greek history or myth or wars, the Peloponnesian Wars or something. I loved debates. I loved just the philosophy. And it was all there. I could go to off-Broadway plays. I didn't go to anything because I was mad at the world. So I was self-restricted in this place that offered all these opportunities. The law school was good for me because it showed me how much work I needed to do what I wanted to do, how much I needed to learn. And whether the question I asked myself when I left was, are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to dedicate yourself to learning all you need? And so I would have to say, in retrospect, it was small enough, it was academically challenging, it was interesting. The professors were almost, to a person, fair to me. It wasn't the best choice as far as being able to distinguish yourself because of the grading system. But I can't look back and offer any complaints. I know in the past I've not said pleasant things, but that had to do with some other reactions.
Let's move forward to the confirmation process. About a third of your book has to do with the confirmation process, and that's been 27 years or so. How is your view of being confirmed and the politics involved? How is all that? Has your view changed of it?
You know, I think it's sort of like surgery. The only minor surgery is on the other guy. I don't think the process is what it ought to be. I think that these are serious jobs, and I think they should be serious. I don't think they should become spectacle. This is not the Roman Colosseum. We're not gladiators. And I think we're going to lose some of our best people who choose not to go through the ordeal. They don't want to have to fight the lion in order to be a judge or to be in government. And I think it's our own fault for allowing this to happen. I was confirmed 5 times in 10 years, and it got increasingly worse. And I think that we are going to, at some point, have the leadership we deserve because we allow the selection process to get out of our control and to have very little to do with selecting the kind of people we need. If you look at, you would think about it, you went through confirmation, and yours wasn't particularly controversial, but it was an ordeal. And what if it was embittered? I think that a lot of people have second thoughts. I can't tell you how many people I know who, in the middle of it, said, "What was I thinking?" And I think that's unfortunate. I think the country is going to lose something because of that. So I don't have bitter feelings or anything like that. I don't have strong reactions, but I think I'm sober in my judgment of it. And I think a lot of the difficulties are irrelevant to the jobs. Think about it. How many people, for example, who have done the job of judging, who actually talk about judges? is usually the people who are doing the most talking have never judged a single case. I just find it absolutely fascinating that a lot of the commentary has nothing to do with the job itself. I found when I got to the DC circuit, I found that job absolutely fabulous. The people there were fabulous. And to the Supreme Court, after going through all those difficulties, the members of the court were just wonderful people to a person. It was a fabulous place to work. You were there. It was a lot of work. It was very difficult our first term. But in retrospect, it was an exciting time. Just the ideas and learning. And everybody there made it as decent a place as it could possibly be. So the court itself is quite different from the ordeal. It's almost the opposite of the ordeal it took to get there.
What are the best and worst things about being a Supreme Court justice?
The best, I think, would have to be interacting with my kids as a clerk to going through life, watching you all. It's just, that's the best part. I'd have to say, too, my wife is now a former law clerk. She is emeritus. We gave her an honorary law clerk degree. But watching her, my wife was 34 years old when I got to the court. Watching her enjoy the clerks and the kids, it is such a joy. I remember when Nicholas was born. Now what is he doing?
It's in graduate school.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so watching all of that, it's just fantastic. I remember when you and Janice got married. You know, it's just that, so that's the best part. The worst part is the loss of anonymity. I don't like the public part, but that's a part of the deal. I'm not going to complain about it. But those of you who are introverts, you know what I'm talking about. We prefer, and it's sort of like I said to my clerks who were introverts of the world unite. And then they said, but do we have to go to meetings? So I read Susan Cain's book, Quiet, which I think is the best book. For those of us who are introverts, that's the hard part, the public part. And you know what I could add to that, and it's not a complaint. All of this is a part of the deal. I have no complaints. I don't like the myth making around the court and who we are. There's a real decided difference between what is said about what goes on in judging and the court and what actually happens. There's the real world and there's the myth of that world. We don't have the time, the energy, or the ink, or the bits or bytes or whatever they call that to change, to engage in that narrative battle. We have work to do. We have to write opinions. I've been around a lot of judges. Whether you agree with them or not, they actually put the work in. It's a wonderful world to work in, where you actually have to write out your opinions and think things through and have arguments and go through all the statutes and go through all the constitutional provisions and go through all the rules of statutory interpretation or construction, all the interpretive canons. And it's fascinating. So I like that world. But then the world that people talk about it, that you don't agree on something. Oh, you hate old people. What? Or you're just, you want to execute people. I haven't met a judge who wants to execute anybody. I haven't met that judge yet. In fact, every judge I have met, going through these cases, look at what it does to your hair. So you start out, your hair is black, you have lots of it. Then all of a sudden, you're follically impaired, and you're like, your hair, what's left, turns gray. And you said, oh my God, another execution. I mean, like every one of us is like, did I get it right? Did I make a mistake? And yet you have the people who create the myth about it, who think that suddenly you're callously doing these things. Those are people who've never stayed up in the middle of the night and voted for one of these things. So I like being around judges. I like the work. I like the world that I'm a part of. I think the world, those who talk about it, are not doing the world justice or the rest of our fellow citizens justice in talking about an important part of their government.
In talking about the work, I noticed in the Supreme Court statistics that for the last 2 years you've written about twice as many opinions as of any of the other justices.
That's because I really don't talk, so I get to write a lot.
Why so many opinions?
Who knows? So Justice Scalia said I was solipsistic. So I said, Nino, I have no idea what that means, but I like the ring of it. So I think that means I really like my own opinions. But then he said once he said, Clarence, you really don't care for other people's opinions, do you? I said, no, I do care, but I prefer my own. I don't know. I think it is really important that when you vote for these things, that you explain why. And that if it doesn't make sense, my granddaddy, I'm not going to use the words he used exactly, but he would say, boy, if it don't make no sense, it don't make no sense. Of course, he would spice it up a little bit. And, you know, things have to make sense to me. When you come from the lower levels in society, poverty, things have to make sense. My granddaddy, you have to feed, either you fed the hogs or you didn't feed the hogs. You either greased the tractor or you didn't grease the tractor. You either planted the corn or you didn't plant the corn. It was binary. It was clear. And I think when we do these cases, we owe it to our fellow citizens to explain in plain language what we are doing. And sometimes when you see me writing, it's because what the court is doing, the premise I think disagree with, and I think it's wrong. And if you go back and you look at the Court of Appeals judges, I think it is a little bit glib, I'm not going to say disrespectful, for us to, when there are differences of opinions in the courts of appeals and the district courts, for us not to explain why we hold a different opinion from them, or not to fully explore the opinions below and just glibly disagree. I think we owe them that respect. So I worked through everything, and I probably put a lot of pressure on my law clerks. I wouldn't clerk for me. That is way too much work. And I tell them that before they come. You sure you want to do this? Why are you doing this? Oh boy, you know there's a 13th Amendment. So
What's changed in your judging over the 27 years?
That is really a good question, Judge. I think it's sort of like if you climb a mountain. When you're at 1,000 feet, you see something. You still look at the same scenery, but you have a different view from when you're at 10,000 feet or 5,000 feet. You see more. I've been doing this so long that you see more. You understand more. The reason I was reading this book on the Plantagenets was because of English common law, which started out, people do a lot of talking about stare decisis. So I decided to teach a course on it to understand it in depth. But then to understand stare decisis, you have to understand English common law. To understand English common law, you have to understand where England came from, the Norman conquest, the Vikings, the Romans. Then to understand that, you've got to actually trace those histories. So anyway, I've done that. Now I'm fascinated by the Plantagenets and what they've done in developing England. What were they doing? What does the exchequer mean? Why did the king pull all this together? But to understand, you got to pull all the history together. But look how many years that takes. That's what I learned at Yale, that this wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And it was a lifelong endeavor. It's what you and I do when we teach constitutional law together. Look at all the cases we've read. Look at how much in depth we've read those cases. I mean, how many people who care about Trop v. Dulles? Right. You and I do. You and I care about it. Flass v. Cohen. Yeah, they cite it, but they don't read it. You and I do. We have to. Why? Because we're messing with other people's constitution. You and I have to do it, and you know why. We have to go back and read the briefs because we're tinkering with other people's constitution. We don't have any unlimited license to do that. And we certainly don't have a right to be reckless with it. So over the years, what you learn is it's like you've gone higher, or another metaphor would be you're peeling the onion. And you understand, you see more. Not because you're smarter or because people love to set themselves up as philosopher kings or something. No, it's because you've been doing it longer. This is what I do. I don't have hobbies. Well, except for rooting against Alabama. But oh, you knew it was coming though, didn't you? Oh my gosh, they stole another national championship. Go away. This is what I do. I do law. And anybody who, it consumes you. And virtually everything I do is in preparation of doing this job. I think I owe this. Remember, it's about your calling. And if you're called to do it, you're called to do it a certain way. If you go back and look at Justice Scalia, look what he died doing. People forget. He had finished, he thought it was our job to fly the flag, to go different places and to talk to people about what we do. He was more outgoing than I am. I'll be honest about that. But he told me, Clarence, you got to fly the flag. You have to go out there. Then the other thing, when he did his work, everything mattered to him. Every sentence, every word, every comma, every idea, it all mattered. And it mattered. That's one of the reasons we trusted each other, because we both knew it mattered. Getting it right was important to both of us. Why would we do it otherwise? Why would we be doing this? This is wrong. How would you look your fellow citizens in the eye if you didn't get it right? If I looked at you and told you, oh, I don't care. I kind of, I go and I watch cartoons, and then, I kind of flip coins for your Constitution, or I kind of just do whatever I want to do. I would never do that, ever, because that's wrong. And he believed the same thing. We took an oath to do it a certain way. So, yeah, I think I have to inform myself in order to make decisions about your Constitution. And you feel the exact same way. And you just became a judge, and you feel exactly the same way, that you have a special obligation. Or you would have been 28 years as a reservist in the military, or the best teacher at GW Law School for a quarter of a century.
Talk about your teaching, Justice.
Well, I knew you'd change the subject.
Yeah. You've been teaching at Georgia and George Mason, at GW. What's all the teaching? What is your goal in teaching?
I think that people make learning, well, let me back up. Did you see The Wizard of Oz?
Yes.
Okay, who was the wizard?
Who was the wizard?
He was that little guy.
He was a little guy. I could have said that.
Yeah. So I think what we do sometimes is we make everything mysterious.
Don't look behind the curtain.
Yeah, we should look behind the curtain. That's what we do in our class. It's not mysterious. There was a young man in our constitutional law class at the end. He said, I'll never look at law the same again. I don't know what his leanings were. I don't care what his ideology is. What we were trying to get him to do is demystify it. It's not that complicated. Why do we make it complicated? Why do we make it inaccessible? I had a buddy who was a quadriplegic. He was one of my best friends. And this is in the days back in the 70s before you had all these flushed curbs and curb cuts. So every time we got to like a curb, it was like the Great Wall of China. And we would have to, if we weren't there to lift him over it, lift him downstairs and things, it was inaccessible to him. And to some extent, that's what we do to law. We start talking about negative pregnants, and we use double entendres and throw in a little Latin and a little this. Why don't we talk in English? You know, that farmer in rural Alabama has a right to know what his Constitution says. And so what I do is, one of the things I say, and I said even when you were clerking, is that genius is not putting a $20, a 10-cent idea in a $20 sentence. Genius is putting a $20 idea in a 10-cent sentence. It is to make it accessible as possible to average people. So when I used to go back home, think about it. I came from a world of illiteracy or near illiteracy. And when you went back home, you could not talk down to people. That's what they would say to you. They wouldn't use the word condescend. That wasn't in their vocabulary. You're talking down to me. In other words, you're putting me down. But you had to explain things to them without treating them like they're lesser human beings. So it's what we used to say in the vernacular back in the 60s, you had to break it down. In other words, you had to speak without losing meaning, without losing content. You had to explain it in a language that they understood. And I think one of the things that we try to do in the opinions is to explain things to people. I think we owe it to people. In order to do that, we have to know it, as we do in the classes. Look at the eyes on the students when we're done. When they figure out that they know more about Lochner now than they did before, simply because we've read all the briefs and articles about it, et cetera, and we know the story behind it. And all of a sudden they can claim it. They understand it. It makes sense. Or if you look, when I wrote separately in the McDonnell opinion, what I was trying to do is, after all this talk of substantive due process, just simply explain to people, we don't know where does it come from? Where does it come from? It's not in the Constitution. But, so you go back and you say, here's what's there. Now, you don't have to agree, but Privilege or Immunities Clause is actually there. Here's what they actually debated. Now, you can disagree with that, but you can see the coherence. You can go to Dred Scott, and you can see that it was, like Tawney is saying, blacks can't be citizens. Well, that's remedied in the 14th Amendment. And then it says you can't deny them privilege or immunities of citizenship. So it all makes sense once you go through the history. And I think that's what I tried to do in the opinions. It's not so much to give you some legal theory, but to give you the progress of this provision. And then to show you where it's connected to some of the other concerns they had about blacks in the South being able to defend themselves.
Justice, I wish we could stay all afternoon, but I've gotten the
Well, they're leaving, but you and I can stay.
I've gotten the signal that the time is up, but thank you for your remarks.
Well, thank you all for spending this afternoon with us. Sorry to take so much of your time, but and maybe we didn't cover everything that you probably wanted us to, but we're going to be talking later on about the Dormant Commerce Clause for those who are interested. So thank you all very, very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.